Last week was a momentous one for President Biden. A major bill moved through Congress that directs billions of dollars toward Intel and other microchip manufacturers around the country. So why is Intel's stock plummeting? I'm Andrew Thien, and this is Beat Check with you, Oregonian. Up next, Mike Rogoway, who covers business and technology for the Oregonian and OregonLive. We talked about the CHIPS Act passing with bipartisan support in both chambers of Congress, what it will mean for Intel, why the company's stock is in freefall, and much more. On the second half of the show, we talked about the recent Oregon Secretary of State audit into the state's employment department. Here's our conversation. Mike Rogoway, thanks for coming back on the show.
Yeah, glad to be here, Andrew.
So, Mike, we've talked previously about the potential for big federal action related to semiconductors, and that happened in recent days. Remind us why this became a big issue and why it had bipartisan support in Congress.
Yeah, this goes all the way back to the Trump administration and its trade fights with China. And during that time, it emerged that the vast majority of semiconductors are made outside of the United States. And we had, in the wake of the pandemic, we had an extreme shortage of semiconductors. And it's not just, we think, oh, well, they power our computers, but it's not just those in our smartphones. They're essential ingredients in every kind of automobile, in every kind of appliance. They play just, everything from being the brains of the device to just playing a little helper, but essential role in managing it. And so we had this great shortage. And so it became clear late in the Trump administration that the U.S., this was a particular vulnerability for the U.S. And the most advanced semiconductors are made in Taiwan, which is obviously a geopolitical risk with China. So as that risk emerged, people said, maybe we should do something to promote the U.S. industry. China, Taiwan, and South Korea all substantially subsidized their industries. So they came up with this $52 billion CHIPS Act, which would directly subsidize the construction of new semiconductor factories in the United States. And after Trump left, President Biden was very much in favor of this as well. And it had bipartisan support in the Senate. It was seen as a bill to help the U.S. compete with China. So it passed in June of 2021 very easily in the Senate. And then the House didn't take it up for a long time. And when they finally did, they included other Democratic priorities around climate change and trade. And those didn't go over with Republicans. So it stalled for another 6 or 7 months. All this time, Intel being Oregon's largest employer, was pushing very hard for this legislation. They have this $80 billion turnaround plan to revive their engineering prowess. And Intel, each factory, they call them fabs, each chip fab is $10 billion a piece. And Intel badly wants to offset that cost. They're building a new fab, 2 new fabs in Arizona, 2 in Ohio, and at least 1 in Germany. And so they're looking to the government to help them get the same side of subsidies that the manufacturers in Asia do.
So this is different than kind of the what we're familiar with out in Washington County, where it's like property tax abatements. This is direct cash.
Well, yes, the bill evolved beyond that, but yes, Oregon provides enormous tax breaks on Intel's property taxes worth I think well over $100 million a year, but it's not cash out of the pocket. And this bill is that. It is, literally cash for these companies. In previous bills, it was capped at $3 billion per factory. I'm not sure where that ended up in the final legislation. I have not seen that specified, but it'll probably be in that neighborhood. And so when you're building 4 factories in the United States, that's a substantial offset for them. So that was something that Intel's new CEO, Pat Gelsinger, has been working on really since he got the job in the winter, in January, February 2021. It finally passed the House, the Senate and the House this past week. The president will sign it very soon. He's been an enthusiastic backer of it. So it's a big win for Intel. It's a big win for Oregon's congressional delegation, which pushed for it. Oregon isn't going to get Now, the final bill, in addition to these direct subsidies, it also includes tax credits for money you spend on improving or upgrading your factory capacity and your technology inside the United States. Also provides some money for semiconductor research. So it's a big win. It'll pay billions for Intel for years to come. And although Oregon doesn't have any new factories on the drawing board right now, companies have gone elsewhere in the country. The research components of this will be a boon for Intel's investments here. And there is hope among civic boosters in Oregon that some of the money that's set aside to fund a new semiconductor research center, or maybe multiple research centers in the United States, that might end up in Oregon. We might end up with some kind of some portion of that, some kind of new semiconductor research center in the state.
Okay, so that's a lot to untangle, and it seems like how could that be nothing other than a big win for Intel? Yet last week, Intel had some bad news to report. Can you talk about what that was?
The Congress finished its work on this bill. It just happened to be less than an hour before Intel had scheduled the release of its quarterly results. And everyone kind of expected Intel's quarterly results would be a disappointment because the PC market has been softening, in part because of the economy, in part because people bought their PCs when the pandemic started to work from home, and they don't need another one, not yet anyway. And so PC sales have been softening, and now it's clear they're really soft, that the demand for this is way down. And so Intel's results, which they issued Thursday, were far below expectations. They cut as much as $11 billion from their annual revenue forecast. It'd be their biggest one-year decline in revenue ever, in percentage terms, at least in the last few decades. So they were awful numbers. Their profit margin is falling badly. And Wall Street was really unhappy with the results. The stock is down almost 9% on Friday, wiped out something like $13 billion in market value for Intel. And the investment analysts were angry, both because it doesn't speak well to Intel's turnaround plan. Not that there's anything fundamentally wrong with the plan, but it's going to be they're going to be spending a lot of money to rebuild the company at a time when revenues are falling. And it's just going to be that much harder to balance.
When you're planning on building big facilities, but your revenue is plunging, that's not something generally that people who own stock in a company are going to be in favor of.
No. Intel's profit margins, their gross profit margins had been up around 60%. They're going to be under 50% now. Their free cash flow, which is one measure of their profitability, has gone negative and will be for some time to come. And investment analysts are particularly unhappy, I think, because Intel didn't warn them this was coming. Publicly traded companies, if you've had a really bad quarter, it's very typical for them to say, as you're halfway through the quarter, okay, we're not going to release our full results for another month or so, but we want to give you a heads up. Things really aren't looking the way we told you they were 3 months ago. Intel didn't do that. And they delivered really terrible results. And, one analyst, wrote to his clients Friday morning. He said Intel's second quarter takes the prize for the worst we have ever seen in our career. And he said, there's a lot of factors going into it. And he says, well, some investors could potentially see a kitchen sink in the results. It seems more likely that things are circling the drain. Is really dire stuff from Wall Street. And the question now is, so Intel's got all this federal largesse coming its way. Are they positioned to take advantage of it?
What's the early read on that, right? Because this isn't, as with any program in any level of government, it's not like you turn on the spigot and it starts flowing immediately. How long until Intel sees the CHIPS Act money come their way?
Not this year. They were clear on that yesterday. It's going to be a process to allocate who gets what. And I could imagine it may be something of a fight. But it won't start coming until next year at the earliest. It could be a long long, tough stretch if the economy stays weak for Intel. That it's just really going to weigh on them. This investment, it's designed, to improve, the flow of semiconductors in the U.S., but it takes at a minimum 2 to 3 years to build a new fab. So, this isn't going to provide any immediate, all this federal money isn't going to provide any immediate benefit to the alleviating the shortages that we're dealing with for all these products we talked about at the beginning: computers, cars, smartphones, appliances. That's still going to be a lot of work to settle that. And of course, that's one of the things contributing to inflation. When the things you want aren't available, it'll take some time to bid up the price. If you want to look at the silver lining, though, I think it's been clear, over the last 20 or 25 years that I've been covering semiconductors closely, that having fab capacity, having factory capacity is ultimately a good thing for a company. That the demand for computer chips doesn't appear poised to evaporate anytime in the future. There will be cyclical ups and downs. But Intel is going to get these new factories eventually. They're going to be very expensive, but they're going to get them. And the federal government is picking up part of the tab. So that's a win. It's a big win. It's just that the benefits are, at least a few years off for Intel.
I'm glad you brought up your long track record covering this industry and this company, Mike. When you take a step back, which is kind of hard to do when we're still in this weird pandemic living, but is this the most interesting moment that you've covered this company?
Yes, I think so. So there were a series of gross missteps and scandals under their former CEO, Brian Krzanich, starting around 2015. They had 2 large layoffs that Krzanich admitted later he mismanaged. Then there was he had an affair with a subordinate, got fired. And Intel made this is the roots of Intel problem, not those other 2 issues. But under Krzanich, they made a series of bad bets on their manufacturing future, and they ended up losing their competitive edge and their leadership position. So that was very interesting from the dynamic of a series of bad news from the company. But what's really interesting right now is that people are paying attention to semiconductors in a way they haven't in the whole time I've been covering this industry. People had literally begun taking it for granted. And the technology became more complex, over the past 6 or 7 years. I mean, it's extraordinarily complex. But the issue was that the features on the semiconductors are down to the atomic scale. And it became very difficult to continue making the improvements in technology that people had become accustomed to. And then you had the supply chain issues accompanying the pandemic, and all of a sudden people realized, oh my God, semiconductors are absolutely indispensable. Computer chips in Oregon, we tend to forget because we can't see them. Other big industries we have, like Nike, you see the shoes everywhere, the logo everywhere. Forest products, we're surrounded by trees. We get that. These are things that Oregon does. But you can't go into these fabs. They shut them off. Everything in there is secret. It's in a clean room. You have to wear a bunny suit even if they let you in. So we forget that this is Oregon's big industry. We have probably the densest concentration of semiconductor manufacturing in the country here. And they account for about half our exports. And so it's really kind of Oregon's moment right now. And there's been a lot of hand-wringing in Oregon over the last year over the fact that all these new fabs are being built in other parts of the U.S. and Oregon didn't get any of them. But Christian Kaler, as an economist at the Employment Department, and Josh Lehner, a state economist, they've pointed out that we've added a ton of new semiconductor jobs in Oregon over the last year, almost as many as if we'd gotten 2 of those factories. That the companies that are already here have been staffing up. We think of Intel, but there's all kinds of smaller ones on semiconductor, analog devices, microchip technology. They're the ones making these power controls and other kinds of relatively low tech chips. They're still very high tech, but it's not the very leading edge stuff. They make those in Oregon, and they end up in cars and appliances, digital cameras, and they've just been killing it the last year and a half because the demand has been so strong. Their biggest issue has been hiring people, finding people.
Yeah. Well, that's a good problem to have when you're doing that well. I'm curious, when you mentioned earlier that we've taken this industry for granted. I'm wondering, I think the general public, I'm sure we always take stuff for granted, but it seems like it takes both sides of the aisle in Congress realizing that to get anything done, right? Where all the kind of the posturing and cramming bills with important stuff that might not be as directly related to the issue of this industry, that was stripped away, and ultimately pretty fast action to get something like this done in Washington within a span of a couple years.
Yeah, I mean, for Intel and for others in the chip industry who have been awaiting this bill, it has felt torturous.
I'm sure. Easy for me to say.
It's been 13 months since the first version passed the Senate, and it's not that different from the final version. So it was pretty agonizing for people. But yeah, not a whole lot. There aren't very many big initiatives that get bipartisan support in Congress, broad bipartisan support, and this did. And I think people are realizing that whether you're, any state that has any kind of manufacturing in it is feeling the effect of the chip shortage right now. Oregon happens to have a very high concentration of manufacturing relative to the rest of the country, but it doesn't matter if you're making chips or cars or dishwashers, you need these chips, and it's slowing down your economy when they're not there. So, as I said earlier, this isn't going to be an immediate fix. We're talking about a period of years, but there is some room for upside optimism.
Anything else I should have asked you on kind of this moment, this extraordinary moment for Intel?
I think the thing you could ask is, and the thing that everyone's wondering is, can Intel carry off its turnaround? And analysts on Intel's call Thursday were like, how do we know that after missing three major upgrades to its microprocessor technology in the past few years, and now they've delayed the release of another class of new chips. How do they know the new big upgrades are on track? And Intel went to some pains to say they are on track. We're measuring that closely. Their CEO, Pat Gelsinger, did say that, one of the things he has to do coming to the company is make sure that they're meeting their commitments to investors and to customers. And he said that, he suggested that perhaps the amount of time he spent on pursuing this federal funding over the last 16 months or so, maybe that had diverted his focus some. He said that will be his focus going forward.
Do you buy that?
Well, he's an engineer. He's very well respected by Intel engineers. Intel's recent track record doesn't give people a lot of confidence, but they insist that all their metrics show things are going the right way. They say they've identified the reasons why they were delayed before, that the primary reason was that they were too slow to adopt a new class of manufacturing equipment called EUV. They're certainly all in on EUV now. So I don't know. I think there is some cause for optimism. Even as there's still a great deal of skepticism.
Well, let's take a quick break, then we'll come back and talk a bit more with Mike Rogoway, who covers business and technology for the Oregonian and OregonLive. Well, speaking of technology, it would not be a podcast we've had in the last couple of years without mentioning at some point the employment department and their wondrous, antiquated computer software down in Salem and I guess around the state. But an audit came out, a long-awaited audit from the Secretary of State that looked at the employment department and how it handled jobless claims during the pandemic and a whole bunch of other stuff. What was that report like?
Well, it was interesting. This was the third major audit of the employment department in the past decade. And the two prior audits had found the same thing, that the department was a mess culturally, that leadership was dysfunctional, and that its computer systems were a wreck. And this audit, perhaps to its credit, didn't dig back into those issues. It sort of took them for granted. And it focused, the fallout from those issues, everyone knows. Oregon was among the slowest in the nation to pay jobless benefits during the pandemic, that so many new programs emerged and there were so many people that were unemployed seeking benefits. Our computer systems in the state just couldn't handle it. And it was a big mess.
The phone systems.
And the phone systems. Yeah. Well, that was the only means they had to communicate with people, really. But for 8 to 10 months, you really couldn't get through on the phone. It was just a catastrophe. It could hardly have gone worse. This report doesn't seek to, this audit doesn't necessarily seek to revisit that or figure out just how bad it was. What it does instead is it kind of focuses on one element that went particularly wrong, and that's what's called adjudication. Most of the time when you're filing for jobless benefits, it's fairly straightforward whether you qualify. If you get laid off because your employer goes out of business, or they can't employ you anymore because they don't have any sales, or the government orders the bar or restaurant to close to prevent the spread of COVID-19. Well, if you lose your job for those reasons, it's pretty clear. You usually qualify for unemployment benefits. But it gets more complicated in some cases. Maybe you and your employer disagree about the reasons you left. And some reasons might, if you quit of your own volition, for example, you don't qualify. Certain types of employers, public school employees, sometimes don't qualify because they're not usually employed year round, but sometimes they do. And so you have this adjudication process where the state looks to see, well, do you really qualify? But this was the real focus of the audit. And the audit found that, going back even before the pandemic, the rules and the procedures for how you handled adjudication weren't clear. They weren't clear to people outside the employment department wondering why they weren't getting their benefits. They weren't clear to the people doing the adjudication. That there seemed to be conflicting rules. The information wasn't all available in any one place. It was a real mess. And as a result, some cases weren't being handled promptly. Some cases were getting lost altogether. Some people were waiting more than 2 years for their benefits without it getting resolved. And this became a major issue. It was a chronic issue before the pandemic. The audit found we knew, from watching what had happened during the pandemic, that it was a major issue once the pandemic hit. Tens of thousands of people were waiting long periods of time for their benefits to have those adjudicated. And so this went into some of the reasons why that happened.
Okay. And where do we go from here? I mean, any fixes coming?
The employment department will tell you that they've been working on this already, and it's true that this was no secret. The employment department recognized it. People seeking benefits recognized it. We certainly recognized it in the news media that this was a major issue. They've hired a bunch more adjudicators. They've made efforts to standardize training and standardize processes and procedures. The audit found, though, that many of those things still weren't readily available and apparent when the audit was concluded. Talking to the employment department this past week, they said, well, since the audit was completed, we have done those things. The proof will be in the pudding. Right now, everything looks rosy right now at the employment department right now because almost nobody is unemployed. We have the lowest unemployment rate in about history, in any time in history. So good times cover up all kinds of problems. We seem to be dancing on the edge of a recession again now. If unemployment rises again, that will be the big test. But of course, by then, it will be too late to fix it if there are, in fact, other problems.
And the computer issue won't be solved by then either.
No, we're looking at 2024. And just to revisit, your listeners will remember much of this, I'm sure. But back in 2009, Oregon and many other states got federal money. In our case, it was $85 million to upgrade our computers, which are running COBOL, a COBOL mainframe from the 1990s. Some of the technology goes back further to the Reagan administration.
Yeah, we're talking Atari here, basically.
Right, yeah. For sure. And people have known, at least since 2009, but really before that this was a big issue. But as prior audits and prior investigations by the Oregonian have found, the agency management was just dysfunctional in the years after the Great Recession. They fired 3 consecutive directors. There was a lot of infighting, and it just didn't get done. And so the pandemic hit, and the audit found that most states that got that money in 2009, they hadn't upgraded their systems either, but their systems weren't nearly as old as Oregon's. In 2013, Oregon's was one of only 2 states still running those legacy mainframes. So I don't know if, I don't know what that other state was, or if they had upgraded it in the intervening 7 years, but Oregon certainly hadn't. And so that's the root of many of our problems here. Yeah.
I mean, we spent so much time as a newsroom, and like on this podcast, we talk about the myriad ways that the state government has failed from a technological standpoint. But this audit kind of laid bare that, here's a key function that's to give, people who are seeking their rightly held benefits from the state. And there's a lack of understanding of how that works from the employees handling it themselves. I mean, that doesn't inspire a lot of confidence. And I'm just wondering what kind of ripple effect that may have, or, how widespread is that when you take one little public facing entity from one state department and people don't know how it works? That's not good.
Well, yeah, it was the Secretary of State who oversees the audit, as she said Wednesday when the audit came out. She says, the damage to the public's trust could take a generation to repair. That this is what people, if there's one thing, we're all paying this unemployment insurance so that this money is available in this situation. It doesn't come out of thin air. We, as workers and employers, are paying it to make sure it's there. And when it isn't, it's a real mess. And as you were suggesting, Andrew, this is not the first time by any means that Oregon has had technological failures on key systems, cover Oregon being the most notorious. We looked some back in 2020 into the reasons why that is. And it's not just Oregon. Any government agency has this kind of issue, and it has to do with, on a high level, that government objectives are different than business objectives, and businesses, it's all right to fail as long as you fail quickly and can pivot. States designed to spec. You can't buy your stuff off the shelf. There's no one single system. You don't go up to, hey, let's download the unemployment management software and we'll go with that, and then everything will be fine. Every state's got its own rules and laws, and whatever you do has to conform to those. So it is a complicated task, but other states demonstrated it's clearly not an impossible one. So it is a real black eye for the state, as well as having been an enormous hardship for many people during the pandemic. And I guess let me say one more thing before I forget it, Andrew. One important finding of the audit, it did appear that certain people, particularly Asian Americans, had their cases adjudicated much more slowly than other races. It also appeared that lower income people had their cases adjudicated much more slowly than others, but they really weren't able to say that conclusively, the auditors, because the state's data isn't complete enough to make that judgment. And that just comes back to our technology. Our data is incomplete. And so it's hard to diagnose the problem and how severe it is and what kind of problems we have.
Well, yeah. And I guess I was trying to tee up the fact that, just not knowing a key facet of your job, when you're working in state government, can have damaging impact on a lot of people. And
for sure.
We saw that kind of bear out here. But anything else you've been covering recently you want to talk about? You're always got something interesting.
Let's go back to technology for a minute, Andrew. I mentioned it briefly that our tech jobs are at a record high now. I mentioned briefly that semiconductor employment surged so much? Well, Josh Lehner, the state's Office of Economic Analysis, he ran the numbers and found that we have finally, after 21 years, Oregon had finally exceeds the number of technology jobs we had and during the dot-com era. It's taken us a long time to get there, but we've gotten back there, and it's important for a couple reasons. Technology is a big share of our economy, but tech wages are a huge share of a huge share of the state's income base. Back in the 1980s, tech made maybe 10 or 20%. Tech jobs paid maybe 10 or 20% more than typical wages. Now they're double the average state wage. The average technology wage is $126,000 a year. So this has become a really vital industry to Oregon. And what's intriguing to me is that Oregon, its tech industry has grown this large without growing any new, really large homegrown technology employers. And we've just become a very welcome destination for tech companies based elsewhere who are looking either for an untapped pool of talent, or when it comes to the semiconductor industry, a population of workers with some very specialized skills, or just a close place to operate. If you're in Seattle or the Bay Area, this is a reasonable place to be.
Well, it's a reasonable idea to read your coverage if you're interested in this stuff. And you're a reasonable man for joining me on a very hot day. And thanks for doing it and for all your coverage.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. It's good to be here.
Thanks for listening to Beat Check with the Oregonian. I shared links to some of Mike's Intel coverage in the episode notes. If you like this show, give us a 5-star rating and review in Apple Podcasts. It really helps others find the show. And tell a friend. Help spread the word. The best way to support our journalism is through a subscription to OregonLive. You can do that at OregonLive.com/pod support. Until next time.